There are two kinds of grief. The kind that breaks you open, raw, ugly, impossible to hide, and the kind that wraps around you like a fine wool coat on a winter evening, elegant, composed, worn with such quiet dignity that no one dares to look too closely at what lies beneath. It is the second kind that interests Hercule Poirot. Christmas, 1952. An English country manor dressed in holly and candlelight. Guests laughing, glasses raised, carols drifting through frosted windows. And at the center of it all, a widow, graceful, sorrowful, utterly convincing. But Poirot notices what others do not. He notices that her hands are still when she speaks of her husband, that her eyes do not fill when they should, that her smile, just once, arrives a half-second too early. Grief, mes amis, makes an excellent mask, especially when old sins require festive cover. The gathering at Ashworth Manor. It had been Hastings who suggested they accept the invitation. Poirot, for his part, had held the cream-colored envelope between two fingers as though it were a mildly suspicious object, which, in his experience, most things were, and read the contents with the expression of a man being asked to climb a very tall ladder in his good shoes. "A Christmas gathering," he said, setting the card upon the mantelpiece with some deliberateness. "At a country manor, in December." "That is rather the traditional arrangement." "Yes," said Hastings cheerfully, not looking up from his newspaper. "There will be draughts, mon ami. There are always draughts in these English houses. The English, they build their homes specifically, I think, to encourage the cold air inside. There'll also be a decent fire, good wine, and Mrs. Ashworth's cook, who I'm told is extraordinary." Poirot considered this. "The cook," he said, after a pause, "is perhaps a sufficient reason." And so it was settled. Ashworth Manor sat some 40 miles outside London, in that particular stretch of English countryside that manages to look both timeless and slightly melancholy, regardless of the season. In December, draped in a thin layer of snow that had fallen 2 nights prior and not quite committed to melting, it looked like something painted on a Christmas card by an artist who had once been very happy and was no longer entirely sure why. The manor itself was handsome, broad stone facade, tall windows lit warmly from within, a wreath of holly on every door. Ivy had claimed the east wing some years ago, and nobody had thought to dispute it. A line of motor cars sat along the gravel drive, and as Hastings pulled their vehicle to a stop, Poirot observed the front door opening to release a brief burst of warmth, laughter, and the faint smell of pine wood burning. "Charming," said Hastings. Said Poirot, already studying the windows. They were received in the entrance hall by a butler of such extreme age and dignity that Poirot briefly wondered if he had come with the original construction of the house. He took their coats with the gravity of a man accepting sacred objects and directed them toward the drawing-room where the other guests had already gathered. It was, Poirot noted immediately, a carefully composed scene. A fire, burning well, in an enormous stone fireplace. A Christmas tree of considerable ambition standing in the far corner, dressed in glass ornaments and small white candles not yet lit. On the mantelpiece, sprigs of holly and a row of Christmas cards. 11 of them, he counted, without appearing to count. 3 round tables had been arranged near the windows, each bearing glasses of warm wine and small plates of things to eat. Someone was playing carols on the piano, in a pleasant, unhurried fashion, as though the music were simply another furnishing of the room. And the guests themselves, 7 in total, before the arrival of Poirot and Hastings, moved and spoke with that particular ease of people who either know one another very well or have collectively decided to behave as though they do. Poirot stood in the doorway for precisely 4 seconds before anyone noticed him. In those 4 seconds, he observed the following. A tall man near the fireplace, red-faced and loud, currently in the middle of a story that 2 other people were laughing at, rather more than it likely deserved. This was Colonel Francis Ambrose. Poirot had encountered his type before, many times, in many drawing rooms. A man who filled space as a profession. Beside him, a younger woman, dark-haired, sharply dressed, watching the Colonel with the polite attention of someone performing politeness. This was, Poirot would later learn, a Miss Diana Hartley, a distant relation of the family. Near the piano, a thin, nervous man of perhaps 50 who kept glancing toward the door. Mr. Gerald Finch, solicitor. He had the look of a man who knew something he wished he did not. And then, at the center of the room, neither quite part of any conversation nor separate from them, Lady Evelyn Ashworth herself. She was perhaps 55. Still handsome, in the manner of a woman who had once been beautiful and had made, over the years, a kind of quiet peace with the transition. She wore deep grey, not quite black, not quite resigned to colour, and a single strand of pearls. Her dark hair was touched with silver at the temples. She held a glass of wine she had not drunk from. She was speaking to an elderly woman seated near the window, a Mrs. Beatrice Hobson, plump and warmly dressed, the kind of woman who exists primarily to make other people feel comfortable. And as she spoke, she smiled. A composed, gracious smile. The smile of a hostess. Poirot watched her for a long moment. Then Hastings said, "I say, do you think we ought to introduce ourselves?" And the moment was over. Lady Evelyn received them with precisely the correct degree of warmth. She was glad they had come. The journey had not been too dreadful, she hoped. Hastings said the roads had been quite good, actually, and she nodded, as though this were genuinely pleasing news. She introduced them to the other guests with the smooth efficiency of long practice, and within 10 minutes, Poirot found himself standing beside the fireplace with a glass of warm wine he hadn't asked for, and Colonel Ambrose's voice arriving at him from the left, like a form of weather. And Ashworth was a good man, I'll say that much. Solid, dependable. Awful business, losing him so suddenly. 2 years now, isn't it? Evelyn's held up remarkably well. Remarkably. You knew Lord Ashworth well? Poirot asked. Oh, years and years. We were at school together, briefly. Lost touch for a bit, reconnected after the war. Good man, the Colonel repeated, with the slight emphasis of someone saying something twice because they cannot think of anything else to say. Good man. And Lady Ashworth, she was content, you would say. In the marriage, the Colonel gave him a look. Perfectly content, devoted couple. What an odd question. Forgive me, said Poirot pleasantly. I am, by profession, a curious man. The Colonel laughed, a large, accommodating laugh, and moved on to someone else, and Poirot returned to his observation of the room. Dinner was served at 7. The table was long and well dressed, white linen, silver candlesticks, a runner of pine and red berries down the centre. The cook Hastings had mentioned proved to be every bit as capable as advertised, and for a time the conversation was general and comfortable, and entirely without interest to Poirot. He ate, he listened, he watched. It was during the soup course that he noticed the first thing. Mr. Gerald Finch, the nervous solicitor, had been seated 3 places down from Lady Evelyn. He had been quiet throughout the early part of dinner, nervously quiet, the kind of quiet that is not peace but its opposite. At some point, Lady Evelyn had made a remark about the new year, something ordinary, something about hoping it would bring better weather than the last, and Finch had looked up sharply, just for a moment, a fraction of a second, and Lady Evelyn, without appearing to notice, had turned her wine glass a quarter turn to the left. It meant nothing, on its own. People turned wine glasses. People looked up sharply. It was Christmas dinner, not a courtroom, but Poirot noted it, filed it away in the extraordinary cabinet of his mind, and said nothing. After dinner, when the guests had retreated to the drawing-room and someone had finally lit the candles on the Christmas tree, Hastings appeared at Poirot's elbow with a second glass of wine and the satisfied expression of a man who has eaten very well. "Splendid evening," he said. "Absolutely splendid. Don't you think?" "The food," Poirot agreed, "was excellent. And Lady Ashworth, charming woman, terribly sad, of course. You can see it in her, can't you? The grief, poor soul." Poirot looked across the room to where Lady Evelyn stood by the fireplace, one hand resting lightly on the mantelpiece, listening to Mrs. Hobson with that same composed, gracious smile. "Yes," he said slowly. "One can see something." He did not say what. The lady in mourning. The following morning arrived grey and unhurried, as December mornings in the English countryside tend to do. Frost had settled overnight on the window panes, drawing its own pale patterns on the glass, and the grounds of Ashworth Manor lay still and white, beneath a sky that had not yet decided what it intended. Poirot was awake early. This was not unusual. He slept lightly at the best of times, and in unfamiliar houses, with their unfamiliar creaks, their unfamiliar silences, the particular way cold air moved through old corridors at 3 in the morning, he slept barely at all. He had lain in the large, well-appointed guest room, listening to the house settle around him, thinking about wine glasses turned a quarter to the left, and the eyes of a solicitor who knew something he wished he did not. By 7:30 he was dressed, immaculate as ever. Hastings once said, not unkindly, that Poirot would appear perfectly groomed at his own shipwreck, and had descended to the breakfast room, where he found, to his mild surprise, that Lady Evelyn was already there. She sat alone at the far end of the table, a cup of tea before her, untouched. She was looking out of the window at the frost-covered garden with an expression that, for just a moment, before she heard his footstep and arranged her face, was something other than composed. It was gone before Poirot could name it precisely, but it had been there, raw and unguarded, and entirely at odds with the gracious hostess of the evening before. "M. Poirot," she said warmly, rising slightly. "You are an early riser. I hope the room was comfortable." "Entirely," he said, helping himself to tea. "And you, Lady Ashworth, you slept well?" A fractional pause. "Reasonably well, thank you." He sat. He did not look at her directly. He had learned, over many years, that people spoke more freely when they did not feel observed. Instead, he looked at the garden, as she had been doing, and after a moment, she too looked back at it, and something in her posture eased very slightly. "It is a beautiful property," Poirot said. "My husband loved it," she replied. And then, as though she had not meant to say quite that, "We both did, of course." "Of course," said Poirot. They sat in companionable quiet for a moment. Outside, a robin landed on the stone balustrade and regarded the frozen garden with apparent dissatisfaction. "You were married long?" Poirot asked presently, gently, as one asks such things. 26 years, said Lady Evelyn. "He died in the autumn of 50, a heart attack, very sudden. I am sorry." She nodded. There was nothing wrong with the nod. It was a perfectly appropriate nod, grateful, a little sorrowful, accepting. The nod of a woman who had had 2 years to practice receiving condolences. That, Poirot reflected, was precisely what bothered him about it. Hastings came down at 8:30 in excellent spirits, having slept, by his own account, like a stone at the bottom of a very deep river. He ate an enormous breakfast, complimented the marmalade at some length, and then announced his intention to take a walk around the grounds before the other guests appeared. "You will not find much of interest," said Poirot, who had already assessed the view from every ground-floor window. "Snow, trees, more snow. That's rather the point, old boy. Fresh air, good for the constitution." "My constitution," said Poirot with dignity, "is perfectly adequate without the assistance of frozen air and wet grass." Hastings grinned and went anyway. Poirot remained at the breakfast table with a second cup of tea and his thoughts, which were becoming, gradually, more interesting. It was Mrs. Hobson who provided the next piece, entirely without meaning to. She arrived at breakfast at 9, cheerful and well-rested, and sat herself down near Poirot with the comfortable authority of a woman who has never in her life felt she was intruding. She poured her tea, buttered her toast, and within 4 minutes had furnished Poirot with more information about the Ashworth household than he could have obtained in an hour of careful questioning. Lord Ashworth, it emerged, had not been an easy man. Not cruel, Mrs. Hobson was careful to say that, but difficult. Exacting. He had strong opinions about how things ought to be done, and an equally strong conviction that they were rarely done to his satisfaction. Evelyn managed him beautifully, of course, said Mrs. Hobson, spreading jam with the thoroughness of someone who takes jam seriously. She always did. 26 years, and I never once heard her raise her voice to him. Patience of a saint, that woman. And was he devoted to her, would you say? Poirot asked. Mrs. Hobson paused. Just briefly. In his way, she said. His way, Poirot repeated pleasantly. He was not a demonstrative man. Poirot. Some men aren't. She took a decisive bite of toast. Evelyn understood that. Poirot nodded slowly. Outside, through the breakfast-room window, he could see Hastings striding across the frost-white lawn with his hands in his pockets, looking thoroughly pleased with himself and the morning. And Poirot sat quietly with his tea and thought about patience. About 26 years of it. About what a woman with patience of a saint might have been quietly, carefully, composedly enduring, and what she might, at last, have done about it. A secret behind the tinsel. It was the Christmas tree that started it, not the tree itself, precisely. It was a perfectly ordinary tree, tall and well-shaped, dressed with the kind of careful attention that suggested either a very particular hostess or a very obedient staff. Glass ornaments in red and gold, thin silver tinsel arranged with more discipline than tinsel usually tolerates, and at the top, a small star of painted wood, slightly crooked, that had clearly been placed by someone in a hurry or someone who had stopped caring about the top of the tree by the time they reached it. Poirot noticed the star on his first evening. He noticed it again the following morning, when he passed through the drawing-room after breakfast. And it was while he stood looking at it, at the slight, stubborn tilt of it against the otherwise composed perfection of the tree, that Miss Diana Hartley appeared in the doorway behind him. "It's been like that for 30 years, apparently," she said, following his gaze. "The same star. Lady Ashworth puts it up herself every year, won't let anyone else touch it." "Is that so?" said Poirot. "Sentimental value, I suppose." Miss Hartley moved into the room, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and stood beside him looking at the tree with the detached appreciation of someone who does not particularly feel things about Christmas trees. Or habit. Sometimes those are the same thing, aren't they? She was sharper than she appeared, Poirot decided. The carefully composed manner, the social politeness of the evening before, had relaxed somewhat in the quiet of the morning, and what remained was a young woman of perhaps 30 who observed things and had, so far, chosen to keep most of her observations to herself. "You are a relation of the family?" Poirot asked. "Distant. My mother was Lady Ashworth's cousin. We see each other, saw each other, perhaps twice a year." She paused. "Lord Ashworth's funeral was the last time, before this. You did not come to the manor in the intervening period." "I wasn't invited," she said simply, without apparent resentment. "Lady Ashworth keeps a smaller circle than people suppose. This gathering," she gestured lightly at the room, "is larger than usual, actually. She told me so herself." "Did she say why?" Miss Hartley looked at him with mild curiosity. "She said she felt it was time. That one cannot mourn forever." A slight pause. She said it very convincingly. Poirot regarded her with interest. "You had some reservation about the conviction." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, I was watching her last night, M. Poirot, at dinner. She is a very good hostess, very composed, very present." She set her coffee cup down on the side table. "My own mother grieved for 3 years after my father died, and she was never once composed, not really. Not the way Lady Ashworth is composed." She said it without accusation, simply as an observation. Then she excused herself and left the room, and Poirot remained with the Christmas tree and the crooked star and the quiet that followed her. He found Gerald Finch in the library. This required a small degree of engineering. Poirot had observed that the solicitor tended to position himself near exits and away from extended conversation, and so he arranged to come upon him apparently by accident, book in hand, with the unhurried air of a man simply looking for somewhere quiet to read. Finch was seated near the window with a newspaper he was not reading. He looked up when Poirot entered with the expression of a man who has been expecting something unpleasant and is now uncertain whether this is it. "M. Poirot. Mr. Finch, forgive the intrusion, I had hoped to find somewhere quiet, but please, do not let me disturb you." He settled into the armchair across from Finch with his book, and for several minutes said absolutely nothing. This was a technique he had refined over many years. Silence, properly applied, was considerably more effective than questions. Finch lasted 4 minutes. "Lovely house," he said, to the newspaper. "Quite," said Poirot. "Known Lady Ashworth long, have you?" "We have a mutual acquaintance," said Poirot pleasantly. "And you, Mr. Finch? You are the family solicitor, I understand." Something tightened almost imperceptibly around the man's eyes. "I handle various matters for the estate, yes. Have done for, 15 years or so. A position of considerable trust, quite. And Lord Ashworth's affairs, they were in good order? At the time of his death?" The newspaper lowered by approximately 2 inches. "I beg your pardon? It is merely," said Poirot, in his most mild and unthreatening manner, "that sudden deaths can sometimes leave complications. Documents not yet finalized, matters not yet resolved. It is very common. I ask only out of general interest, you understand. A professional curiosity." Finch stared at him for a long moment. Then he folded his newspaper with great deliberateness and stood. "Lord Ashworth's affairs were handled appropriately and in accordance with his wishes," he said, in the careful, constructed tone of a man reciting something he has rehearsed. "Everything was entirely in order. If you will excuse me." He left. Poirot remained in the armchair, fingers lightly steepled, looking at the space where Finch had been sitting. Everything was entirely in order. Not yes, of course, not perfectly straightforward, but that specific phrase, in that specific tone, with that specific absence of elaboration. In Poirot's experience, the most revealing thing a person could do was answer a question that had not quite been asked. That afternoon, the guests gathered in the drawing room for tea, and someone proposed a game of cards, and for 2 hours, Ashworth Manor was full of the ordinary comfortable noise of a Christmas gathering. Laughter, mild argument about rules, the occasional cry of triumph from Colonel Ambrose, who played with the aggression of a man conducting a minor military campaign. Poirot played badly. This was deliberate. He had found, over the years, that people were far more forthcoming around a man they believed to be slightly foolish than around one they suspected of noticing everything. It was during the third hand that he made his small, calculated error, misread a card, played the wrong suit, apologized with such genuine-seeming confusion that Hastings gave him a sideways look of surprise. Poirot caught the look and gave the tiniest shake of his head. Hastings, to his credit, said nothing, and Lady Evelyn, across the table, smiled at Poirot's error with a warmth that reached her eyes. It was the most natural expression he had seen on her face since their arrival, which told him, in its own quiet way, rather a great deal. That evening, when the house had grown still and the last of the candles on the Christmas tree had been carefully extinguished, Poirot stood at his bedroom window and looked out at the snow-covered grounds. Behind him, on the small writing desk, lay a single sheet of paper on which he had written 4 things. The wine-glass. Quarter turn, Finch. What does he know? 26 years. Patience of a saint. The star. She puts it up herself. Every year. He looked at the list for a long time. Then he wrote a 5th line, slowly, and underlined it twice. What did Lord Ashworth do that required 26 years of forgiving? He set down the pen. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft and indifferent, covering the grounds of Ashworth Manor in fresh white silence. Poirot watched it fall, and thought, and did not yet have his answer. Poirot's first mistake. It was Colonel Ambrose whom Poirot suspected first. He would, in later days, be somewhat reluctant to admit this. Not because suspecting the colonel was entirely unreasonable. The man was loud, he was present, and he had known Lord Ashworth for decades, which in Poirot's experience was either a mark of deep loyalty or a very long time to accumulate grievance. But because the manner in which Poirot arrived at his suspicion was, he would privately concede, not entirely the product of his celebrated little grey cells, It was, in fact, mostly the moustache. Colonel Ambrose had a moustache of considerable confidence, broad, well-maintained, and deployed at all times with the authority of a man who had never once doubted its effect. And there was something about it, about the whole presentation of the man, the bluster, the noise, the way he occupied a room, that Poirot found instinctively suspicious, which was, he would later acknowledge, not reasoning. That was simply irritation dressed up as deduction. The morning of the 23rd had brought with it a brief clearing of the sky, pale winter sun lying flat across the snow, and most of the guests had gone out of doors in the tentative English way, as though the sunshine might be a mistake that could be corrected at any moment, and ought therefore to be used immediately. Poirot had remained inside. He was in the process of conducting what he privately called a gentle reconnaissance of the ground floor rooms, moving unhurriedly from one to the next, touching nothing, observing everything, when he encountered Colonel Ambrose coming out of Lord Ashworth's old study with a slightly too casual expression and a newspaper under his arm that Poirot was fairly certain had not been in the study when he himself had passed it 20 minutes prior. The colonel stopped. Poirot stopped. They regarded one another for a brief moment. "Poirot, lost your way."
"A little exploration only," said Poirot pleasantly. "It is a fine house. Many interesting rooms." Quite. The colonel gestured vaguely with the newspaper. "Just retrieving this."
"Left it in there earlier." "Of course," said Poirot. He watched the colonel's broad back retreat down the corridor, and then stood very still outside the study door, thinking. The newspaper explanation was almost certainly true. Men like Ambrose did not, as a rule, have the patience for elaborate deception. But the study itself, Lord Ashworth's study, kept, Poirot had been told, exactly as it was at the time of his death, was interesting. He went in. It was a well-ordered room. Dark wood, leather chairs, bookshelves arranged with military precision. A desk of impressive solidity sat before the window, its surface clear except for a blotter, a pen stand, and a small framed photograph. Poirot looked at the photograph. Lord Ashworth, a broad-shouldered, severe-looking man of perhaps 60, stood in what appeared to be a garden, not this garden, somewhere else. Beside him stood a woman, not Lady Evelyn. The woman in the photograph was younger, dark-haired, smiling at the camera, with the unself-conscious ease of someone who did not know, or did not care, that the photograph would outlast certain inconvenient facts. Poirot stood looking at it for quite some time. Then he made his mistake. He decided, with a confidence that felt at the time entirely justified, that he understood the shape of the thing. Lord Ashworth had kept a mistress. Lady Evelyn had discovered it. 26 years of patience had finally, at some point before the convenient heart attack of autumn 1950, run entirely out. It was neat. It was plausible. It accounted for the grief that was not quite grief, for Finch's discomfort, for the photograph kept in plain sight by a man who had perhaps not imagined anyone would connect it to anything. He was so satisfied with this construction that he very nearly missed what was actually in front of him. The photograph, the garden, the woman. He had looked at the woman. He had not looked at the garden. Had he looked at the garden? At the particular stone wall visible at the left edge of the frame, at the ironwork gate behind the two figures, at the very specific and identifiable shape of the hedgerow in the background, he would have recognized it immediately. It was the garden of Ashworth Manor, and the woman in the photograph was not a mistress. But Poirot did not look at the garden, not then. He was too pleased with his theory. And theories, as he had cause to know, and occasionally forgot, have a way of making a man look at exactly the wrong thing. He replaced the photograph. He left the study. He went to find Hastings and tell him, with quiet confidence, that he believed he understood the matter. He was wrong. The clue in the fireplace. It was Hastings who found it, which Poirot would never quite admit bothered him. Not that Hastings found things. He did, occasionally, with the cheerful randomness of a man who was not looking for anything in particular, and therefore sometimes stumbled across precisely what was needed. But that he found it while Poirot was still comfortably wrong about Colonel Ambrose still arranging his neat and plausible theory like ornaments on a shelf, was the sort of thing that stayed with a man. It happened on the evening of the 23rd. The guests had gathered again in the drawing-room after dinner, a somewhat quieter gathering than the first evening, the initial festive energy having settled into something more comfortable and less performative. Mrs. Hobson had fallen pleasantly asleep in her armchair near the window. Colonel Ambrose and Mr. Finch were engaged in a game of chess that appeared to be causing both of them considerable suffering. Miss Hartley sat apart with a book she was actually reading, which Poirot noted with approval. Lady Evelyn was at the fireplace. She stood with one hand resting on the mantelpiece, the same posture Poirot had observed on the first evening, and was speaking to no one in particular, simply watching the fire with that composed and faintly unreachable expression that had been occupying Poirot's thoughts since breakfast on the first morning. Hastings had positioned himself near the fireplace, not out of any investigative intention, but because, as he had explained to Poirot in a whispered aside, it was the warmest spot in the room, and his left knee was giving him trouble in the cold. He stood with his back to the fire, glass in hand, in the uncomplicated manner of a man warming his knee, and talked with Lady Evelyn about the countryside and the snow, and whether the roads would be passable by Christmas morning. Poirot sat across the room and watched and thought about the photograph and the woman in it, and felt quietly pleased with himself. Then Hastings crouched down. It was an entirely natural movement. He had set his glass on the hearth and crouched to retrieve it, and in doing so, brought himself momentarily level with the grate, and it was there, pushed far to the side of the fireplace, behind the decorative iron fender, almost invisible against the dark surround, that he saw it. He did not say anything immediately. He picked up his glass, straightened, and continued the conversation with Lady Evelyn about the roads. But Poirot, watching, saw the slight change in Hastings' posture, the fractional stiffening, the way his eyes moved, just once, to Poirot across the room. Poirot set down his own glass. It was another 20 minutes before Hastings was able to detach himself without appearance of purpose. He found Poirot in the corridor outside the drawing-room, examining a landscape painting with the focused attention of a man who had absolutely no interest in landscape paintings. "I found something," Hastings said quietly. "In the fireplace, behind the fender, pushed right to the side. I don't think it was meant to be seen. What is it? Part of a letter, mostly burned. Only a fragment left, really. But Poirot," Hastings hesitated. "The handwriting. I only saw it for a moment. I couldn't take it without being observed. But the handwriting on the fragment, it wasn't a man's hand." Poirot was very still. "You are certain?" "Reasonably. Small, neat, slightly backward sloping. And the fragment? I could only make out a few words, mind you, but one of them was a name." "What name?" Hastings looked at him. "Evelyn." They went back separately. Hastings returned to the fireplace and resumed his position, and when the opportunity presented, Colonel Ambrose demanding Finch's attention over some disputed chess move, Mrs. Hobson stirring and requiring assistance with her shawl, Lady Evelyn crossing to speak to Miss Hartley, he retrieved the fragment with the practiced casualness of a man who had, over the years, developed certain useful skills in the service of a very demanding friend. He delivered it to Poirot in the corridor 5 minutes later. It was small, perhaps a third of a page, the rest consumed by fire. The edges were blackened, and one corner crumbled slightly at the touch. But the center portion had survived, and Poirot held it carefully beneath the corridor lamp and read what remained. The handwriting was, as Hastings had said, small and neat, and slightly backward sloping. Feminine, certainly, but more than that, controlled. This was not the handwriting of someone in distress. This was someone writing with deliberate, measured care. The surviving fragment read, "Cannot continue as we have. You know this as well as I. What was done cannot be undone, and I find I am no longer willing to—" and then a gap where the fire had taken the page. "Evelyn must never know. I have your word on this, or everything we have." And then another gap. "By Christmas, it will be settled. I promise you that much." Poirot read it twice. Then he read it a third time, slowly, and the neat and plausible theory about Lord Ashworth and a mistress began, quietly and with some insistence, to come apart. Evelyn must never know, not written to Evelyn, written about her, which meant the letter was not from a mistress. It was from someone writing to Lord Ashworth, or possibly someone else entirely, about Lady Evelyn. About something Lady Evelyn must not be permitted to discover. By Christmas it will be settled. Poirot looked up from the fragment. The corridor was quiet. The drawing-room sounds muffled behind the closed door. The low murmur of conversation, the occasional pop of the fire. "Well," said Hastings. "I have been," said Poirot after a moment, looking at entirely the wrong thing. "The Colonel? The Colonel is guilty of nothing more than a confidence in his moustache that the evidence does not entirely support." He folded the fragment with extreme care and placed it in his breast pocket. "The letter, Hastings, it is not about what Lord Ashworth did. It is about what someone did not wish Lady Ashworth to know." "What did they not wish her to know?" "That," said Poirot, "is now the correct question." He did not sleep well that night. He lay in the large guest room, with the frost returning to the window panes and the house settling around him, and turned the fragment over in his mind, with the careful persistence of a man working a knot loose from a length of rope. Evelyn must never know. The woman in the photograph. Not a mistress. He was now almost certain of that. Someone else. Someone connected to this house, to this family, to a secret that had required, apparently, a letter of such sensitivity that it had been kept, and then, at some point during this Christmas gathering, burned. But not burned thoroughly enough. And by Christmas it will be settled, written, he judged by the paper and the ink, some years ago. Not recently. Which meant that whatever had needed settling by Christmas had either been settled long ago or had not been settled at all, and someone was here, in this house, at this gathering, because it still required resolution. He thought about Gerald Finch, who knew something he wished he did not. He thought about Lady Evelyn, turning her wineglass a quarter turn. He thought about the crooked star at the top of the Christmas tree, which she put up herself every year and would not let anyone else touch. And then, slowly, like a shape emerging from fog, not complete yet but present, definably present, he began to see the outline of something quite different from what he had supposed. He sat up in bed at 2:30 in the morning, reached for the small notebook on the bedside table, and wrote a single line. The letter was not burned by Lord Ashworth. Lord Ashworth is dead. He stared at it. Someone in this house burned it. Someone who is here now. Someone who has been waiting, perhaps for 2 years, perhaps longer, for the right moment. He wrote one more line beneath it. The secret does not belong to the dead man. It belongs to the living woman. He set the notebook down. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the grounds of Ashworth Manor lay in absolute stillness beneath a clear and indifferent December sky. Somewhere in the house a clock struck the half-hour, and then was silent, and Poirot lay back against the pillow with his eyes open, and the shape of the thing growing slowly, steadily clearer in the dark. By morning, he would know where to look. He was almost right about that. Hastings gets it wrong too. Hastings announced his theory at breakfast. This was, in retrospect, entirely predictable. Hastings had a particular relationship with theories. He arrived at them with great enthusiasm, presented them with complete conviction, and defended them with the touching loyalty of a man who had not yet learned that confidence and correctness were not the same thing. Poirot had observed this pattern for many years and was fond of it, in the way one is fond of a reliable clock that nevertheless runs slightly fast. He had, it emerged, been thinking through the night. "It's Finch," he said, buttering his toast with the decisiveness of a man delivering a verdict. "Obviously Finch. The man's been nervous since the moment we arrived. He knows something. You said so yourself. And solicitors. They're in the middle of everything, aren't they? Wills, documents, financial arrangements. If Lord Ashworth had something to hide, Finch would know about it." "This is true," said Poirot carefully. "And the letter, whoever burned it, had access to the drawing room. Finch was there all evening. He had every opportunity." "Also true." Hastings looked pleased. "So, Finch discovered something in Ashworth's papers, something damaging. Perhaps he's been using it. Quietly, carefully. The man's a solicitor. He'd know how to be careful. Blackmail, Poirot. That's what this is. Poirot poured his tea. And Lady Ashworth? Victim, said Hastings promptly. Entirely. The poor woman has been paying Finch to keep quiet about whatever her husband did. And the grief, the composure, all of it. It's not concealment of guilt. It's the exhaustion of someone who has been under sustained pressure for 2 years. He sat back with the satisfaction of a man who has assembled a complicated piece of furniture and found no parts remaining. Poirot was quiet for a moment. It was, he reflected, not a bad theory. It was internally consistent. It accounted for several of the observable facts. It was also, he was now fairly certain, wrong. But wrong in an interesting direction, which was almost as useful as being right. It is a very good theory, Hastings, he said. Hastings looked immediately suspicious. Why do you say it like that? Like what? Like you're about to tell me it's completely wrong. I am going to tell you, said Poirot, that it is perhaps 60% correct, which is, in my experience, the most dangerous kind of theory. It is correct enough to feel true, and incorrect enough to lead one confidently in the wrong direction. Hastings set down his toast. Which 60%? Finch does know something. That much I believe. And the letter was burned deliberately by someone present in this house. These things I think are right. Poirot looked at the window, at the pale morning light on the snow. But Finch is not a blackmailer, mon ami. Look at the man. He is frightened, yes, but it is not the fear of someone with power. It is the fear of someone who knows too much and wishes very sincerely that he did not. There's a difference. All the difference in the world. A blackmailer is a man who has converted knowledge into leverage. Finch has converted knowledge into sleeplessness and an inability to enjoy his Christmas dinner. Poirot tapped the table lightly. He is not the architect of the pressure, Hastings. He is caught beneath it. Hastings considered this. Then who burned the letter? Someone who has been living with this secret for a very long time, said Poirot quietly. Someone who came to this gathering not for Christmas, but because something needed, at last, to be finished. Lady Ashworth. Poirot did not answer immediately. He looked down at his teacup, and for a moment something crossed his face that was not quite certainty. Something more complicated than that. The expression of a man who can see the shape of the truth and is not entirely sure he wishes to reach it. I think, he said at last, that it is time I spoke properly with Mr. Finch. He rose from the table, straightened his waistcoat with his customary precision, and paused. And Hastings, say nothing of this to anyone. Not yet. Of course, said Hastings, with the mild indignation of a man who has been told this many times and feels it is no longer strictly necessary. He then went directly to the drawing-room and told Miss Hartley that he thought the solicitor knew something frightfully important. Poirot, fortunately, did not witness this. The truth beneath the grief. Poirot found Finch in the corridor outside the library. The man was not going anywhere in particular. He had the look of someone who had been walking the house in small, purposeless circuits, the way a troubled mind moves the body without direction or destination. He stopped when he saw Poirot, and something in his face shifted. Not surprise exactly, but the particular resignation of a man who has been expecting a conversation he does not want, and has finally run out of corridor. Mr. Finch, said Poirot pleasantly, I wonder if you might spare me a few moments. Finch looked at the library door, then back at Poirot. I suppose, he said. They sat across from one another in the same chairs as before, Finch near the window, Poirot across from him. But the quality of the silence between them was different this time. The previous silence had been Poirot waiting for Finch to speak. This one was something more direct than that. Poirot placed the fragment of burned letter on the table between them. Finch looked at it. For a long moment he said absolutely nothing. Then he closed his eyes briefly, in the manner of a man who has rolled a dice and seen the result he feared. Where did you find that? In the fireplace, said Poirot. Behind the fender. It was not burned quite completely. No, said Finch quietly. I suppose it wasn't. You burned it. It was not a question. Finch seemed to understand this. He looked at the fragment on the table with an expression that was equal parts relief and exhaustion. The expression, Poirot thought, of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told he may set it down. I should have done it years ago, Finch said. I kept it because I don't know why I kept it. Evidence, perhaps. Protection. Some foolish instinct. He shook his head. And then when Lady Ashworth wrote to invite me for Christmas, after 2 years of silence, I thought perhaps she had decided. Perhaps she intended to. I wasn't sure. I brought it with me to burn it properly and be done with it. And yet you hesitated. I always hesitate, said Finch, with a flat, tired honesty. It is my great failing. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Mr. Finch, I need you to tell me what you know. All of it. Not to protect Lady Ashworth. I think we are past that point. But because the truth has a way of emerging regardless, and it is considerably less damaging when it emerges properly. Finch looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the window, at the pale December sky beyond the frost-edged glass, and he told him. It had begun, Finch said, not with Lord Ashworth's death, but 12 years before it. Lord Ashworth had a brother, younger by 6 years, a man named Robert, charming and unreliable in the specific way of certain younger brothers who grow up in the shadow of someone steadier and more capable than themselves. Robert had made poor decisions in business, poorer ones in his personal life, and had eventually arrived at the door of his brother's solicitor with a problem of some considerable legal seriousness. He had, in the course of a failed investment venture, obtained money under circumstances that did not bear close examination. The amounts were not enormous by the standards of the Ashworth estate, but the manner of their obtaining was such that discovery would have meant prosecution. Robert had come to Finch in desperation, and Finch, young then, newer to the practice, and more susceptible to the persuasions of a man in genuine distress, had done what he should not have done. He had helped conceal it. Lord Ashworth had known, had sanctioned it in fact, not out of love for his brother, Finch thought, but out of the Ashworth family's deeply ingrained aversion to scandal. The money was quietly restored through estate funds, the records adjusted, and Robert had been dispatched to live abroad on a modest allowance, with the clear understanding that distance was the condition of continued silence. And Lady Ashworth, Poirot asked. Knew nothing, said Finch. That was the agreement. Lord Ashworth was very specific. She was not to know. He said she would not understand the necessity. Poirot was very still. But she found out. Finch looked at him. How did you… The letter fragment. Evelyn must never know. Written in a woman's hand. Not Lady Ashworth's hand, I think. Someone else who was party to the arrangement. Someone who was also, at some point, concerned that she was becoming aware. Finch nodded slowly. Robert's wife, Margaret. She wrote to Lord Ashworth, perhaps a year before his death. She had reason to believe Evelyn had found certain documents in the estate records. She was frightened. The letter was an appeal, I suppose, a warning. And did Lady Ashworth find the documents? The silence that followed was answer enough. She found them, said Finch quietly, approximately 8 months before Lord Ashworth died. Poirot sat with this for a moment. 8 months. 8 months of knowing, of living in this house, managing this household, sitting across the dinner table, from a man who had spent 12 years protecting a family secret at the expense of her knowledge and her trust. 8 months of the patience of a saint, applied now not to an exacting husband, but to a devastating betrayal. She said nothing to him, Poirot asked. Not that I know of. She came to me instead. Finch's voice was careful now, each word measured. She came to my office in London. She had the documents, copies she had made. She was very calm, M. Poirot. Extraordinarily calm. She told me what she had found, and asked me to confirm it, and I did, because by that point I was tired of it, all of it. What did she ask of you? Nothing immediately. She said she needed time to think. She left, and 3 weeks later Lord Ashworth had his heart attack. And she— Finch stopped. Yes? He looked at Poirot with the eyes of a man choosing his next words with great and painful care. She telephoned me the day after the funeral. She said that she supposed matters had resolved themselves, in a manner of speaking, and that she would be in touch regarding the estate arrangements. The room was very quiet. "Mr. Finch," said Poirot after a long moment, "Lord Ashworth's heart attack. Was there any question, at the time, of—" "No," said Finch immediately. "The doctor was unambiguous. His heart had been weak for years. There was no question raised, and no reason to raise one." "And yet," said Poirot gently, "you kept the letter." Finch said nothing. "You kept it," Poirot continued, very quietly, "because you were not entirely certain, not of what she had done, if she had done anything, but of what you yourself knew and had chosen not to examine too closely. And that uncertainty has been with you for 2 years." Finch looked at his hands. "I am not a brave man, M. Poirot." "No," said Poirot, "but you are, I think, an honest one, which is perhaps why it has cost you so much to be otherwise." He picked up the fragment from the table and held it for a moment. Then he stood, smoothed his jacket, and moved toward the door. "M. Poirot," Finch's voice stopped him. "What will you do?" Poirot paused at the door without turning. "I am going," he said. "Speak with Lady Ashworth." "And then?" A long pause. "And then," said Poirot, "I will decide." Confession by candlelight. He found her in the drawing-room. It was late afternoon, that particular hour of December days when the light fails quickly and completely, as though the sky has simply lost interest and the world contracts to whatever warmth and illumination exists within 4 walls. The candles on the Christmas tree had been lit, and they burned in small, steady points of gold against the dark branches, casting the room in a light that was gentle and slightly uncertain, the way candlelight always is. Lady Evelyn was alone. She stood at the window, looking out at the grounds where the last of the daylight was dissolving into blue-grey dusk, and she did not turn when Poirot entered. But she spoke. "I wondered when you would come," she said. Poirot closed the door quietly behind him. He did not sit. He stood near the fireplace, a respectful distance, and looked at her profile against the fading window light. She turned after a moment and faced him, and her expression was not what he had expected, not fear, not calculation, not the composed and gracious mask of the hostess. Something considerably simpler than any of those things, something that looked, Poirot thought, very much like tiredness, the deep, settled tiredness of a person who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally, in some private interior sense, decided to put it down. "Shall we sit?" she said. They sat, she in the armchair nearest the fire, Poirot across from her, the candle-lit Christmas tree between them and the darkening window at her back. "You spoke with Gerald," she said. "It was not a question. I did. He told you about Robert, about the money, about the documents I found." "Yes." She nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already made her peace with. She looked at the fire for a moment, and the light played across her face, the silver at her temples, the fine lines around her eyes, the particular stillness of a woman who has spent a great many years in the company of her own thoughts. "I owe you some truth, I think," she said at last. "I think," said Poirot carefully, "that you owe it rather more to yourself." Something shifted in her expression, just briefly, not quite a smile, something quieter than that. She had found the documents, she said, on a Tuesday in February, 1949. She had been looking for an insurance record in the estate files, something entirely ordinary, and had found instead a set of ledger entries that did not correspond to anything she recognized, annotated in her husband's hand with references she did not initially understand. She was not a foolish woman. It had taken her perhaps 2 days to understand what she was looking at. 26 years, she said quietly. I had given him 26 years, and he had spent some portion of that time at least, protecting his brother's dishonesty with our money, our name, and my ignorance. Treating my ignorance as a convenience. A pause. As an asset. "You were angry," said Poirot. I was, she said simply. Yes, enormously, quietly. You said nothing to him. I went to Gerald first. I needed to understand the full extent of it before I decided what to do. She looked at her hands. I came home, and I thought for 3 weeks about what I intended to say to my husband, and how I intended to say it, and what I expected to happen afterward. And then he died, said Poirot gently. And then he died. The fire shifted, settled. One of the candles on the tree guttered slightly in some imperceptible draught, and then steadied. M. Poirot, she said, looking at him directly now. I know what you are wondering. I know what Gerald has been wondering for 2 years, in that quiet, miserable way of his. I want to tell you plainly, I did nothing to hasten my husband's death. His heart was weak. Dr. Carmichael had been warning him about it for 4 years. I did not. She paused, and something very controlled moved through her expression. I did not cause it. Poirot looked at her for a long moment. I believe you, he said. She held his gaze steadily. Do you? Yes, he said. And he did. Not because the alternative was unthinkable, but because he had sat across from a great many people over the course of his career and had learned, with some reliability, the specific quality of truth when it was spoken without performance. What I think, Lady Ashworth, is that you are a woman who had every reason to hate her husband and chose instead to grieve him. Because grief is what one does. Because 26 years, whatever they contained, were also 26 years. She was quiet for a long time. I did grieve him, she said finally, and her voice was different now, lower, stripped of its careful composition. That is the part that nobody would believe, I think, if they knew everything. That I was genuinely, that I missed him, not the man who kept secrets and protected his family's name at my expense, but the other man, the one who read aloud to me on winter evenings, who always burned the toast and was deeply affronted when I mentioned it. A breath. Both things can be true. I have found that is often the case with people one loves for a very long time. Poirot said nothing. There was nothing to say that would improve upon what she had just said. After a moment, she looked at the Christmas tree, at the small crooked star at its top, and something in her face softened. My daughter made that star, she said quietly. She was 7. She died the following spring. A fever. That was the first terrible thing. A pause. I put it on the tree every year because it is the only part of Christmas that belongs entirely to me. Not to the house, not to the family, not to what is expected. Just to her. Poirot looked at the star, the slight, stubborn tilt of it. The painted wood, worn smooth with 30 years of careful handling. He thought about what Miss Hartley had said. She puts it up herself every year, won't let anyone else touch it, and felt, with some force, the particular sensation of understanding arriving slightly too late. Not the facts. He had the facts now, assembled and clear, but the shape of the grief, the real grief, beneath the mask of it. It had been there from the beginning. He had been looking for concealment and had found it. He had not been looking for genuine sorrow and had found that too, wound through everything, impossible to separate from the rest. What happens now? Lady Evelyn asked. Her voice was composed again, but differently so. Not the composure of performance, but of a woman who has said the true thing and is prepared for whatever follows. Poirot was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Lord Ashworth died of a weak heart, as the doctor attested. Robert Ashworth lives abroad on a modest allowance, and I see no present reason for that arrangement to change. Gerald Finch is a solicitor of good standing who has, perhaps, been rather too conscientious in the keeping of certain old documents, which have now been disposed of. He paused. As for Lady Evelyn Ashworth, she is a widow who has managed her grief and her household with admirable composure, and who has invited her friends for Christmas, which is a perfectly ordinary and commendable thing to do. She looked at him. That is all. That, said Poirot, is all. For the first time since his arrival at Ashworth Manor, Lady Evelyn Ashworth smiled without calculation, without performance, without the half-second delay that had told him, on the very first evening, that something lay beneath the surface. It was a small smile, tired
and genuine and entirely human. "Thank you," she said quietly. Poirot rose, smoothed his jacket, and looked once more at the crooked star on the top of the Christmas tree.
"Non, non," he said softly, almost to himself. "It is not thanks that are required." He did not elaborate. He wished her good evening, and left her there in the candlelight, with the fire and the tree and the small painted star that belonged to her daughter and to no one else. In the corridor, Hastings was waiting with his coat on and the expression of a man who has been patient for a considerable time and feels this ought to be acknowledged. "Well," he said, "what happened? What did she say? Is she— Poirot, did she do it?" Poirot looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his own coat from the stand and began to put it on with deliberate calm. "She did nothing, Hastings, except survive a marriage that asked rather more of her than it gave, and grieve a man she had complicated feelings for, and put a crooked star on a Christmas tree every year for 30 years. Hastings blinked. "That's it?" "That," said Poirot, buttoning his coat, "is rather a great deal, I think." Hastings considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly, in the way he did when he did not entirely follow, but trusted that he would. Eventually, upon reflection, they collected their bags. They said their goodbyes, Poirot to Lady Evelyn with a small, formal bow, Hastings with considerably more warmth and a promise to write that he would not keep, and walked out into the cold December night. The car was cold, and the roads were dark, and the countryside lay silent under its covering of snow. Hastings drove, and Poirot sat beside him and looked out at the dark fields passing, and said very little. After some miles, Hastings said, "Happy Christmas, Poirot." Poirot looked out at the dark and the snow, and thought about a woman sitting alone by a candle-lit tree, with a crooked star at its top, and the particular weight of secrets that turn out, in the end, to belong to grief rather than guilt. "Yes," he said quietly, "Happy Christmas, Hastings." And the car moved on through the winter dark, and behind them, growing smaller and then gone, the lights of Ashworth Manor burned warm against the cold December sky.